Welcome to the Utility Security Podcast, your command center for all things utility security. From power plant warriors to grid guardians and even curious citizens, this podcast is your essential briefing on keeping up to date with knowledge and insights for securing our nation's utilities. Expert intel through interviews with security chiefs, tech wizards, and policy shapers. Tune in as we explore the latest vulnerabilities, industry best practices, and inspiring stories of resilience from the frontline heroes keeping our grids secure.
Thank you for listening to the Utility Security Podcast. I'm your host, Curtis Marquardt. For this episode, we sat down with Shawn Wallace, the Director of Critical Infrastructure for Unlimited Technology, and Glenn Engel, the Global Business Resilience and Security Manager for the AES Corporation, to get their insightful perspectives on how to best evaluate risk, prioritize assets, and align your spend and future budget needs to building a truly effective security posture.
All right, so we'll go ahead and get started with the first question, which is, really just kind of wanted to gauge what inspired you to focus on these areas for your presentation, looking at the threats and how to evaluate risk, and then prioritizing the spend based on those vulnerabilities.
Yeah, basically, in our industry, there's so much focus and emphasis on technology, right? Like Curtis, you mentioned, the magazine is going to be published at GSX. There's going to be hundreds of vendors there with kind of all the latest technologies and advancements, which is great to see and very exciting. But at the same time, just deploying technology doesn't necessarily close off your risk and the gaps that you might have in your security program or your security system. So in kind of talking with each other about it and others in industry, we thought it'd be a good idea to just take a step back and really look at why are we putting in all this equipment in the first place, and prioritizing our assets so the money that we're spending on all this technology and controls is going into the right place, but also making sure that it's actually solving the problem. I think a lot of times, if you have a building, everyone knows you put up security cameras and put in access control, but is that really going to stop the adversary that you're trying to address with putting the security in the first place? So by taking a step back, doing a risk-based approach in determining which assets should be your largest priority, and then using something like an attack sequence diagram to see how an adversary would try to compromise the facility and then build your security program off of that, you're actually getting a much more pointed way to spend your money on the technology in the first place, because you can directly correlate it to covering off the gaps that you've got in your system.
And limited budget.
Yeah, that's always a challenge. So, you're talking about solving problems. Let's talk about the problems itself in terms of the threat landscape. What are some of the trends you're seeing, and what are some things you feel our readers should be thinking about in terms of what the threats look like out there, and what things are maybe popping up that they should be more aware of?
Well, there really are quite a few, of course. You get the usual ones of theft of equipment and copper, things like that, so they can just for the monetary value, and criminal mischief, crimes of opportunity, they're just always out there. But increasingly, I think all industries, but especially critical infrastructure like utilities and generation facilities, are seeing more activity from nation states, ideological threat actors who are out there looking to disrupt the services, maybe gain some notoriety to their cause, or just to disrupt societal norms in the hopes that they're going to sow some anarchy and maybe achieve whatever ends it is that they're trying to achieve. And and other threats that we have that aren't necessarily security related, but we also see a lot of more and more now are natural disasters. We've even, you see things like gang activities, blackmail, extortion, or threats to veiled threats that, hey, we'll come in and provide some external protection for you for financial gain for whatever gang or activity group is trying to control their area, if you will. And we see that more in third world countries, but it is potential anywhere.
Okay. So I'll transition now to kind of going through your outline here. I notice you're spending some time. You mentioned this at the start. What is some strategies utility security leaders should use when going through the asset prioritization process? What are identifying their crown jewels and going through a process of prioritizing certain assets over others?
Yeah, there's really two in the utility sector. If you kind of look at it from a high level, right? The first is through the NERC-CIP standards. And those of us in the utility sector are very familiar with NERC-CIP, where they have you go through an evaluation process looking at your assets in terms of impact to the bulk electric system. And then the NERC-CIP standards obviously come with some controls and requirements, plans, procedures that are associated with minimizing the risk to the bulk electric system. Then utilities are audited by the regional entities under NERC for compliance against the NERC-CIP standards, right? So that's really one way to look at it. We all know that compliance does not equal security. And at the same time, security doesn't necessarily equal compliance. So while utilities that fall under NERC-CIP have to go through that exercise, the second avenue is really to look at your assets and your risk in terms of business aspect and impact. Really, business impact is the word I was looking for. So you may have an asset that falls outside the NERC-CIP standards, but you've determined from a business standpoint that if that asset is compromised, the result is unacceptable to the business, or the level of risk that gets introduced with an asset being compromised is unacceptable to the business. So that really demands a second process where you're analyzing things against their impact to the business and prioritizing your risks based on that component of it. And one of the areas where I find gets overlooked is the assets that are outside of kind of the traditional generation transmission assets that a utility would have. There's a lot of large utilities out there that are developing new technology. It could be software, it could be equipment. I saw recently where AES has actually built an entire robot partially powered by artificial intelligence that automatically installs solar panels. So they want to be able to protect that asset because it has value to the business. So you've got intellectual property there that you want to protect. So beyond kind of NERC-CIP and then business aspect, you also have these other elements that need to be protected as well when it comes to things like intellectual property or technology that a utility has developed and invested in.
Okay. Something you mentioned at the start of this interview was the adversary sequence diagram process. Can you talk a little bit more about that and why it's an important part of the strategy that utilities need to factor in?
So the adversary sequence diagram basically identifies the paths that an adversary would take to penetrate a facility and accomplish their objective. So kind of like Glenn mentioned earlier, you have different flavors of adversaries in critical infrastructure. common copper thieves to advanced nation state actors, right? And just about everything in between. When we install security systems, I think a lot of times people follow kind of the obvious playbook in their design without really giving consideration to the different adversaries that may be trying to compromise a facility. What the ASD then does is it takes a very methodical approach where you start with the adversary that you're trying to address. So let's say it's a pressure group and they want to compromise a substation to black out a town to send a message. So then you develop a scenario based on how they would carry out that attack. And you use the scenario to time the different steps of the attack and then see how your security controls can either prevent, deter, or detect that adversary. And by going through this, it really daylights whether or not your physical security systems have been designed properly, because gaps become apparent right away. Every time I've done this exercise, gaps manifest themselves pretty easily. And it not only allows you to identify these gaps so you can close them, but when you have this data and you've gone through the exercise, then you can approach the budget holder and say, hey, this is a high priority asset that we identified through our risk prioritization process. We've run these scenarios. The scenario is entirely realistic. You could take a look at it, and we've identified these two gaps. And I need this much funding to invest in these controls to close those gaps and dramatically reduce the chance that the adversary would be successful.
Okay, that's a great segue to my next question, which is to talk a bit about, the spending part of it and the budget sort of aspect of this that, is part of your presentation. So using that data, you say is a great way to ask for budget. Are there any other strategies or recommendations you would give to our readers in terms of ways to prioritize spending and also go and ask for additional funds when needed?
Well, one of the benefits of an ASD is that you kind of look at your, on an asset level, the infrastructure that you have in place currently, the potential attack vectors, what are maybe some of the easiest ways or the most likely ways that an adversary may come in to try and, grab the crown jewels or take you down, whatever they're trying to achieve. And by doing that, it's easier, I think, to go to management and say, look, I've done this analysis and I can, support it with some diagrams and some other data to help sell it, to say, this is where we need to spend our money, or this is where we need to prioritize our efforts on an asset by asset basis. So just because we have a substation, for instance, if it may not be the highest that serves X amount of customers, it may not be the highest level, or vice versa. We may look at something that says, well, this is a smaller substation, but it feeds a hospital or some other type of critical customer base that may impact not only them, but impact us as a business from a reputational standpoint, from a regulatory standpoint, or other things that could come in. And so you start to look at things differently than just monetarily.
Okay. Yeah, it makes me think of that software issue a few weeks ago, and the cascading effects it had on airlines and all of that Microsoft bug, and to really think about the layers of customers that could be impacted. Final question. Speaking, just want to kind of speak to kind of the leadership at utility organizations and just share some key perspectives or insights as it relates to the challenges of physically securing utilities. Some things they maybe they're not in the trenches, but some insights they might need to know, or that our security folks should be communicating to those upper level folks.
Yeah, in our industry, I've never found someone that says they want less security. And what you're really faced with is that we're trying to get the most amount of security or the most amount of risk reduction for the funding that's available. And that's just part of business. So the challenge with security teams then is, how do I prioritize my program elements given that I've got a fixed budget, typically every year? So gaps are always going to remain. That's a fact. That's a fact of it. And it's really incumbent on the business to then, accept risks that are posed by the gaps and to be constantly moving the bar forward by closing them whenever possible.
Right. Well, we're like any other industry. We've got everybody's clamoring for more dollars at budget time, right? We've got our marketing, and we've got our HR, and we've got our other groups that need to spend. So sometimes the other part of it is laying out a vision, a roadmap to that management to say, look, we can't get everything that we want this year. We realize that, and we accept that. However, here's our 5-year plan, for instance, and these are what we'd like to see implemented in the next several years. So some of that is an awareness level and education of management that to help them realize what can be, what we should have, and that we're realistic in our expectations of what's going to happen when.
Don't forget to visit our website at utilitysecurity.com for exclusive intel, resources, and a community of fellow utility security professionals. Stay safe, stay informed, and stay tuned for your next mission briefing.
The views, information, and opinions expressed during this podcast are solely those of the individuals involved and do not necessarily represent those of Utility Business Media and its employees. It is strongly recommended that you discuss any actions or policy changes with your company management